Hi, I'm Darcy. You guys have seen me up here a few times lately. You're probably sick of me by now. But the bright side about getting to do multiple sermons in a row is I get to do multiple parts to a sermon. So this week we're going to be looking at a part 2 of the discipleship series that we're doing at the moment, and in particular, how to do discipleship. There's some cool alliteration there. How to go about being a disciple is what we're going to be looking at today. It's sort of like a build on to last week and what we looked at. But before we get into it, if you'd like to close your eyes, and I'll say a prayer. Dear God, thank you that we can all come and worship here today in relative peace and safety, and I thank you for everybody that was able to make it. Pray that you'll be with those that aren't able to join us, God. May they still receive a blessing from you, and be with me now. Help it to be your sermon and not mine. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. So this week, we're going to pick up exactly where we left off last week. If you cast your minds back, if you were here, right, we touched on the origins of discipleship, both as a word and as a principle. Right? In particular, being a disciple of God and what that means. Right? We looked at the qualifications that are required for being a disciple of God. We looked at the sort of responsibilities that go with it, and ultimately the mission of all disciples of God and how that's different to regular disciples of just any other person. If you didn't get a chance to watch it, it is on YouTube. You should check it out. But today we're going to take a deeper look into how exactly we as disciples of God go about fulfilling the mission that disciples of God have. The mission that we find in the book of Matthew chapter 28, where Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations. He says that to his disciples then. He says that to us as his disciples now. Go and make disciples of all nations. That's his final instruction that he gave to us before he left. And so ever since then, followers of God, disciples of God, have been trying to fulfill this mission in various different ways. The question that I want to look at today is, how should we as a congregation, how should we as individuals go about fulfilling that mission? What does making disciples of all nations look like in your life? What does making a disciple of every nation look like in your life? Because I touched on this point very briefly last week, and at the time I said that I can't tell you what you should be doing because it's going to look different for every individual. And that's still true. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. I can't tell you that in order to make a disciple, you need to go up, you need to walk 30 steps, you need to go do this and exactly this and that and follow the recipe. Because making disciples is an individual thing, and it will look different for every single one of us in our own lives. An outreach program that works at one location with a particular group of people might not work the same or find the same success at another location. Not because people haven't prayed enough, not because you're not doing your job or put your trust in God, but because it looks different in every situation. And you might think that that makes it harder to make disciples. For me to say that I can't give you the recipe, yet still expect you to make the cake. But see, every person is making a different type of cake. I love cake. There's lots of different types of cake, right? Some of us were making a chocolate cake, and other of us are like making a cheesecake with icing or without icing, right? Some of us are dairy or gluten-free. That's all right. You still get a cake, apparently. There are all sorts of different cakes that we're making, and each of us is making a different one. So I can't give you the recipe to make my cake because you might be making something completely different. That's the point. Same with discipleship. I can't give you the recipe on how to make disciples. Here's step 1, 2, and 3. Because what making a disciple looks like for you is going to be different. That is to say, God is going to use each of us in different ways to bring different people to God. I'm going to be able to reach people with my experience, with my expertise, with my personality that you won't be able to reach. And likewise, you, with your own unique skill set, with your own experience, with your own skills, are going to be able to reach people that I can't reach, that no one else can reach. And so that means that it's vitally important that each of us plays our own part. Because if you don't contribute, if you don't go about making disciples, there might be someone that no one else can reach. There might be someone that isn't here because you didn't do your bit. The good news that God promised us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58, he said that no work that we ever do for God is in vain. No work that is done for God is done in vain. That means that if you have a genuine heart for what you do, God is able to use it. It might not be in the way that you expect or in the timing that you anticipate, but God will use it. The important thing is that you do your part. so that God can use you. There is a right way and there is a wrong way to go about making someone a disciple. This happens most frequently when we let our enthusiasm to share God with other people take precedence over their more important needs. Right now, in response to that, a lot of people would say that, well, God is the most important need. How can there be something that is more important than God? Right? It's my job as a Christian to make sure that people realize that God is the most important thing. But to someone who doesn't yet believe in God, someone who's struggling to pay their rent, someone who's, struggling with mental health, is not ready. God isn't up there. God isn't up there on the priority list to someone who doesn't believe in God, right? In psychology, we call this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. One of my favorite things to talk about in psychology, the list and the order that every human being has regarding their needs in order to survive and in order to thrive, right? The original theory that Maslow gave out there has been altered slightly as more and more people have contributed research that backs up different points, right? The principle and the listing of the needs has been long established in the field of psychology. You can see it up there on the screen, okay? At the very base, you've got to imagine you're going to building it like a pyramid. At the very base, you have your physiological needs. You're talking things like food and water, right? You need these to survive, right? And once those are satisfied, generally the next thing that people look to prioritize are things like safety. So you're talking, do you have a house to live in, right? Do you have a roof over your head at night, a warm blanket, that sort of thing? Are you in a crime-free area? All right, then next, you've got your social needs. Do you have friends? Right? Do you have connections, relationships with people? Next is your esteem needs. Okay, how do you view yourself? Do you have a positive self-image? Do you like the way you look? Do you have good mental health? That's the next. And then finally, your self-actualization. How can I improve myself? How can I make myself better? God generally fits into that self-actualization level. Although you could argue that God is a social need as a part of a relationship, but generally speaking, he fits into that self-actualization levels. When it comes to applying this to making disciples, I use this illustration that I got the first time I learned about it, actually from Sue at Pathfinders was the first time I heard about it. Imagine a poverty-stricken community, right? Like poverty so bad that people can't afford food for themselves. Everybody in that community is suffering. They can't afford the basic things, right? Their physiological needs are not being provided for. But all of a sudden, a social worker comes into the community, right? They see a lot of sadness. They're seeing that the community is in a very low place. And so as a social worker, they decided the best thing to do is to distribute free self-help books to everybody in the community that is sad. Free self-help books for everybody. As a Christian, in a Christian context, this could be like a missionary seeing people in poverty and going, oh, y'all need a Bible. I'm going to give you a Bible, right? The Bibles in this situation, the self-help books, are not useful to the community in terms of the hierarchy of needs. It's not practical for them to have a Bible or a self-help book in this case because they are still struggling to have their basic physiological needs cared for. Concerns about relationships or spiritual things are not a priority. And when you don't know what you're going to eat for dinner that night, getting advice on how to make meaningful friendships is not something that you're going to be interested in. And we can do the same thing in principle with our own discipleship, right? It might not be as dramatic as a Bible study for someone who doesn't have food, but it still has the same effect, right? Whenever we try and go straight to the top and give them the self-actualization part of things without meeting all of the lower needs, they're not going to be interested in anything we have to say. If you jump straight to the top, you don't have a base, a foundation to build anything on. So it's going to all fall apart. The principle that this hierarchy of needs shows us is that in order for a person to be receptive to our attempts to bring them into spirituality or to Bible studies or whatever the aim of your outreach is, in order for the person to engage with that and recognize in themselves that, yes, I do actually have a need for God, other things in life need to be satisfied first. Jesus, in his ministry, understood this principle really well. Obviously, Maslow didn't come out with his research until much later. But Jesus understood people, and he let it play out in his own discipleship. Turn with me to the book of Luke, chapter 19. Luke chapter 19. We're going to be reading from verse 5. Luke is the third book of the New Testament. You got Matthew, then you go to Mark, and then Luke chapter 19. A little heading there that says Zacchaeus meets Jesus. Right? Here we have the story of Zacchaeus, who at the time was a tax collector, which meant that he had no friends, because people viewed tax collectors in a very bad way. Like, it is funny, but actually, like, he would have been very lonely, very, very sad kind of guy, because the job of the tax collector is to take the money from the Israelite, the friends, and give it to the enemies, give it to the Romans. That's his job. People viewed them as traitors. People didn't like them. They weren't loyal to country. Zacchaeus wouldn't have had a lot of friends. He was a very lonely individual. He was rich, granted, but he was lonely. And so in terms of his needs, right, physiologically, at the bottom, he's fine. He can afford things, right? He also had shelter. He's got a nice house. He's got security that he needed. That's fine, right? His primary need is actually third on the list, right? He needs relationships. And then esteem levels building on top of that. He wouldn't view himself in a very nice way. He wouldn't view himself in a very nice way. He was very down on himself, right? Because he wasn't getting people to hang out with him because they didn't like him. So what does Jesus do, right? Reading from verse 5, it says, when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him. Jesus looks up, sees Zacchaeus, and says, Zacchaeus, come down quickly, for today I am going to stay at your house. I'm going to stay at your house today. And Zacchaeus comes down at once. Zacchaeus come down very quickly and received him gladly. Some translations say joyfully, right? Zacchaeus was happy that Jesus had asked to go to his house, right? This makes sense because Zacchaeus wouldn't have had company very often. He wouldn't have any sort of positive interaction with people. So this would have been a high day for him, right? Because not only does he now have a friend that wants to come and hang out at his house, but this friend is literally Jesus. This friend has a crowd that follows him all around. This guy is popular. A man that is so hard to get to that Zacchaeus, when he just wanted to see Jesus, had to climb up a tree. Right? This same man who's so popular, got so many friends, is now voluntarily wanting to go to his house and spend time with him. Right? It must have done absolute wonders for his self-esteem and boosted his view of himself. Right? It cured his loneliness so much so that even as Jesus is still there with him, the first thing he says is, you need to give back. Sorry, I jumped ahead in my notes. Zacchaeus says, I'm going to put right everything that I have done wrong. Everybody that I have wronged, I'm going to pay back. I'm going to make right everything that has been wrong. And Jesus says in verse 9, this day salvation has come to this house. Zacchaeus has received salvation because of his confession, because of his ability to put right everything that he has done wrong. As a result of Jesus meeting Zacchaeus' fundamental needs in that order, not jumping straight to the discipleship. Jesus met him where he was at, socially speaking, because that was where the need was. Right? If Jesus had come and the first thing he had said was, you need to give back all the money that you've cheated from people and right all the wrongs, Zacchaeus would have ignored Jesus and just gone on his way and not done anything to change his situation because he wasn't at that stage yet. He wasn't in that self-actualization stage. He was lonely. Jesus didn't need any sort of divine intervention to be able to make this judgment call. It wasn't like God told him, actually, this man's really lonely. You need to go make sure that you meet his needs, right? Jesus was just basic observations, right? As a tax collector, he would have been wearing really nice clothes. He would have been, fancy arraignment and jewelry and whatnot. Jesus could immediately see that this man before him is not in need of any basic needs like food or water, right? We can see that this man is not homeless. He's not crazy, right? He's a standard guy. So simply working up the chain, simply by process of elimination, you can see that the next thing is his relational needs. How can I meet this man's relational needs? I can form a relationship with him. And boom, Jesus invites himself over for lunch. right? This didn't work on just Zacchaeus, right? Jesus had this stock standard approach that he used for pretty much every tax collector that he came across, right? Because they all had that same social need, right? If you go back with me to chapter 5 of the book of Luke, Luke chapter 5 and verse 29. Jesus had this stock standard approach that he used for pretty much all the tax collectors because they all were fine physiologically. They were all safe, but they were all lonely. Luke chapter 5 and in verse 29, it says, Levi, who was also a tax collector, made him a great feast in his own house. And there was a great company of tax collectors and sinners that sat down with them, right? Jesus goes up to Levi, he's made friends, and Levi and Jesus put together a great feast for all the tax collectors so that they can come together and be friends, right? Jesus knew that the tax collectors were lonely, and so the best way to get them into a position where they're ready to hear about God, where they're ready for that self-actualization stage, is to satisfy their need for loneliness. And Jesus did all that he could to satisfy that need, right? Using Christ's method, he satisfied their fundamental needs first. And often, as in the case of Zacchaeus, once the fundamental need has been met, the person comes to a need for God of their own volition. Jesus doesn't need to prompt them and say, hey, will you be interested in becoming a disciple? The person voluntarily goes, hey, I want to be a disciple. The person comes to God on their own. But how do we take this information? How do we use it and apply it in a modern sense, right? I think we do have tax collectors in modern society, but they function a lot differently to how they did in Jesus' time. So how do we go about reaching lots of people? During my time at Arise, which for those of you who aren't aware is a discipleship school that's run in northern New South Wales. My sister's actually there right now, so shout out to Ellen if you're watching. Hi. She watched last week's one. I was really happy. A huge component of the discipleship course is a practical time where you go out and you make disciples. Now, the way I came across Arise, if you hadn't heard my testimony, it was very last minute. It was I didn't know what was going on, and then I was there, right? So I knew of Arise, but I didn't know anything about what was involved. So imagine my surprise when I rock up there, and in the first week, I think I'm going to be hearing from amazing evangelists and doing Bible studies. That's great. And then Robbie, the outreach guy, gets up there and he says, okay, everybody, today we're going to start our outreach. Now, hands up those of you who are nervous about the outreach component. And like a whole bunch of hands went up, and I was like, what? He's like, hands up those of you who almost didn't come because of the outreach component, and like the hands stay up. And I was like, oh my goodness, we've got to go door to door, knocking on people's houses and seeing if they would be interested in doing Bible studies with us, right? Learning about God. It's a good thing to try and share God with other people. And as an outreach method, going door to door, I should say, has reached a lot of people who would not have been reached in any other way. But for me, it was not something that I was comfortable with, right? An introvert's worst nightmare, to go up uninvited to somebody else's house, knock on their door, and spark a conversation with them about God and see if they're interested in doing Bible studies with you, despite the fact that you know nothing about them, right? My outreach partner will tell you, she watched me go from this like bubbly, bouncy sort of personality in class to, as soon as we get into the car, just silence. Reserved, like a lot of you who know, like, Darcy was quiet for a time. Like, I just would not talk. I was just withdrawn, right? Because the way it would work is you would go up to someone's house, you would have a little survey with you, and you would ask them the questions and sort of gauge from their answers if there were any areas that you could potentially do studies with them about, right? Like, we'd start like, hey, do you know who God is? You know, do you believe in a God? In your opinion, is there a God? Was one of the questions. And then, okay, in your opinion, like, how did the world come to exist? You know, was it a creation, or was it an evolution, or some other, theory, and other questions that are supposed to spark sort of deeper questions in people's minds, like, oh wow, yeah, I've never really thought about that before. And then you got an opportunity to come in, and sort of, oh hey, like, if you want cool answers to these questions, I can come back. That'd be cool. And then they slam the door in your face, right? Because at the very end, the last question is always, do you want to have Bible studies, right? If all else fails, you haven't been able to get anywhere, it's just, hey, do you want to have Bible studies? And very rarely did we ever actually even get that far. Like, it's very rare that you actually got to the end of the survey. Most of the time, people saw who you were or saw what you were trying to talk about, and they just No, not interested, right? Even after hundreds of houses and doors across multiple weeks of doing this outreach, we did not get a single person who was interested in having Bible studies. It was a hard thing to deal with. It was very demoralizing, right? As a cohort across the board, it wasn't just me and my outreach partner. There were other groups going across the North New South Wales area. We didn't get many studies at all as a group. It was a very difficult thing to deal with. We were all praying for God to come through for us and give us, a chance to have Bible studies with someone, but it just wasn't working. I started praying for God to come up with a way for us to stop doing door knocking. Can I get out of it? Like that times you're like doing your homework and the deadline, you got like that test and you all of a sudden become very religious. You're like, please, come on God, come through for me here. Right? I was like, please God, I don't want to do door knocking anymore, right? Not in a way like I wanted to get out of it. I mean, I did, but I'm not like not interested in telling other people about God. But what I wanted, the ideal situation would be my schedule was just so filled up with Bible studies already that there's no point in me going out to get more because I wouldn't be able to fit it in, right? But the issue that I had was that the only way to fill up your schedule is to go out and do door knocking and ask people if they want to do Bible studies, right? This was my conundrum, and that's why I needed to pray. But God answered my prayer. God answered my prayer in a very roundabout way, right? Because if you weren't aware, at this time when I was doing this outreach, the area flooded. The area flooded. It flooded really badly. Shout out to my friend Samuel Vidacek for the photo credit. He took his drone up. It was amazing. A lot of people had to move out of their homes because it was flooded. That's a win, right? No one at home. No one answering. No, what happened was the very first night when the flood had hit, right, it came very suddenly. We were all exhausted because we'd just done our studies, we'd done our outreach on top of that as well, and it was raining while we were doing our outreach, so it was very exhausting, right? After the first night, we all just collapsed. And somewhere close to, I think it was about 10:30/11 p.m. at night, right? We should have all been in bed, but we were all just unwinding after a busy day. One of our students was in contact with someone who was setting up an emergency shelter where people could stay. And being the good Arise students that we were, right, independently of each other, 3 separate groups showed up at the shelter to help out. And we were all like looking at each other really shocked, like, oh, I didn't know you would be here. And they were all also shocked that 3 separate groups had showed up to help. Right? It wasn't required, it wasn't part of the curriculum, but we all decided to go out and help organize mattresses and food donations and give people warm clothing. But most importantly, and our biggest job there was to be a reassuring presence to people who had just lost their entire home and contents in a matter of hours. The one funny thing about the situation was seeing the people that had slammed the door in your face like a few days before, like sheepishly ask you if you had any food for them. It was kind of like, well, how the turntables. Why are you guys volunteering at the shelter, right? But therein, right, lies the truth of the matter, the point that I'm trying to get at, right? The people didn't care how much we knew until they knew how much we cared. The people didn't care how much we knew until they knew how much we cared. We tried to go out and share with people the information that we had learned about God, but no one was interested in what we had to say. But now you have a situation where we volunteered our time, and even though we're all exhausted, everybody can see that we care for them as people. Now, all of a sudden, they're interested in what we have to say. For all of us that went there, the best memories from those nights volunteering didn't come from distributing food or water, although that was rewarding. But the moments that we remembered and the highlights came from a vulnerable person who's outside of their home and their life's just been turned upside down, and they're asking if you would mind praying with them because the situation's really hard. The person that slammed the door in your face when you asked them if they wanted to learn about God is now asking you to talk to God on their behalf and see if he can help them out in this situation. God used this situation where someone who has a job, a comfortable house, right, all the food and water that they need is now more concerned about their promotion at work than learning about God. Or where a person struggling with mental health and self-esteem is very low, and so they aren't interested in what the Bible has to say about creation. God used this situation, God used the floods to reach people that wouldn't have been interested in God in any other way, shape, or form. Because when their shelter is taken away and their home is destroyed, all of a sudden, what relationships that person is struggling with matter less to them. When all the food that you did have in storage has been just wiped out, your priority isn't about which outfit looks best to wear to work tomorrow. And so when a Christian is able to come in that situation to rebuild and provide those needs and work the way up again, then the person is able to be reached. And again, just like with Zacchaeus, often the one trying to make disciples, we went there with the express intent of, community presence, but really it was the people that asked us to pray for them. We weren't asking if we could pray with them. After the initial flood was over, there was the horrible task of cleaning up everything. Our outreach time changed from hey guys, go grab a spirituality survey and get out there, to, all right everybody, go put on some gloves and gumboots and get out there. We went out in teams, and in a similar way to before, we went door to door. But this time, instead of asking people, hey, did you have a moment to fill out a short spirituality survey? Instead it was, hey, what can we do to help you? We noticed that your backyard is in shambles, your house has been destroyed. What can we do to help you out? We've got a team here that's willing to work for hours on end. Can we give you a hand? And everybody worked really hard to do a lot of very difficult jobs. There's my friend Josh on the left there, looking amazing in gumboots and shorts. Right, there was a lot of mud removal and a lot of drying out things. But every time, without fail, whenever we went to go do a job for someone, that person would ask, hey, why are you guys volunteering? What prompted you to come and help me out with my house? And they were always receptive in every situation to whatever we had to say. It became such a reliable thing that in our teams, we actually had a designated role that someone would go and talk to the person who owned the property and just have a chat with them about spiritual things while the rest of us could work. That became a specific role and a job to have because the person would always ask. We received so many Bible studies by doing this. So many people were interested, and plenty more that we didn't even help out saw us going around and just turned up to church the next week just to see what all the fuss was about. God used this situation, which allowed us to meet people's needs, which made them ready to hear about God. So our outreach at that point wasn't about trying to get people to do spirituality surveys. Instead, we just went door to door and talked with people about their lives. This is after the cleanup was over. All right, we've done everything that we can do. Let's go door to door. And instead of, hey, do you want to fill out a spirituality survey? You just have a chat with them. Try and figure out where they're at, right? People at this point, they recognize the Arise people. We'd been around the community a lot. And so because of that involvement, they're always happy to talk to us. They invited us into their homes, and as we talked, people naturally just opened up about the struggles that they were having in their lives, right? Whether it was with relationships or esteem or shelter or whatever, it allowed us to have an in to try and meet the need of whatever it was, and then let the person initiate the spiritual talk. God made a way for us to use Christ's method of meeting their needs to reach people that door knocking and surveys had failed to do. And the same can be applied to your life, right? Like, how many people have you tried to talk to about God, right? You've got friends, you've got family that you've tried to witness to, but it just seems like people aren't interested in whatever it is that you have to say. The answer and the solution to the issue is that there is a fundamental need, a gap that needs to be filled before they're ready for that. So your job as a disciple maker isn't to wait for that need to be resolved, isn't to wait for somebody else to fill the gap and then you can jump in and start the conversation. Your job is to figure out what that need is in someone's life. Figure out what the need is and then do your best to fill the need in that person's life. Find the need, then fill the need. That's what Jesus did, and it's what we should do if we want to be effective. In terms of finding out what that looks like, for each of you, finding out the need is going to look different, right? Going back to what I said at the beginning, right? Each of you is gifted in different ways. God has equipped you to meet the needs of certain people that others are not equipped for, right? You've got a gift or a talent for cooking, right? That is something that I am not gifted and talented in. You're going to be able to reach people in a different way that I cannot reach. And practically speaking, Australia is one of the hardest countries in the world to disciple, right? That's not used as an excuse as to why we're behind as a country, but to understand why other places are ahead, right? The biggest issue that we have right now is that we are a rich country. Australia is a very rich country, generally speaking, right? Lots of people compared to other parts of the world are very rich. The average Australian can afford the basic items required and needed for survival, and those things are available to us. To the extent that all the physiological, all the psychological needs are already met. And so as Christians, this is a struggle for us because we're really good at providing for those physiological and shelter safety-based needs, right? If you remember our key text from Acts chapter 4 before, Acts chapter 4 and verse 34 to 35. Right? The church is really good at meeting the physiological needs. Acts chapter 4 and verse 34 and 35 said, "Neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were the people that had property or land or houses sold them and brought the profits to the disciples and laid them at their feet, and the distribution was made to every person according to their need." Right? People gave all their money, they gave all their time, they gave the profits, and we were able to provide for the physiological and the safety and shelter needs of all the people. Right? The church has always been good at pulling monetary resources together to help people out, which is really good if you're in the first two stages. But unfortunately, what we've learned is that the majority and the bulk of Australians are sitting not in the first two stages, but in the next two, that social and esteem area. Their main needs are to do with their own self-esteem and with their own relationships. This is true across the board for Western society, right? Most people are struggling with mental health, ideas of self-worth, finding meaningful relationships, right? Those are the struggles of the average person that in Australia we're trying to reach. And it's very bad that these are the struggles for most people, and maybe even we ourselves are dealing with those sorts of issues. It's definitely not good that these are our issues that we need to deal with. But the good news is that just like Jesus and Zacchaeus in the Bible, there is a solution to overcoming those levels of problems. Our greatest asset as a church in a modern context, right, isn't the impressive buildings or the vast sums of money or the organizations that we have within the church. Although these things are good and they're very cool, they were essential at one point, but now our greatest asset, our greatest pro that we have going for us as our church is our sense of community. That's how we meet the needs of people in a modern context, is our community that we have as a church. Our focus right now needs to be on meeting the relational and the self-esteem needs of the people within Australia. That's how we're going to do it, through community, through providing people with a place where they can socialize with people in a positive way, through positive affirmation of people's esteem to make them feel better about themselves, not in a pandering way, but in a genuine, I care for you way. As a church, we need to get better at this. But as a church, that is the step forward. That is the way forward when it comes to making disciples. And so my challenge for you as a church, but also as an individual within the church, is to find people around you, find people around us that you can meet the needs of. Find somebody and find out what their need is. You don't have to pry. People will often just tell you. Just have a conversation with them and get to know them. Because now that we understand what the needs are likely to be, right, it's easier to find them. It's easier to look for them. It's easier to spot them. And then it's easier to go about meeting that need. Discipleship doesn't need to be complicated or difficult. God's going to work in your life and use any effort that you make for good. He's going to bring you people that you can reach. And just like when God worked with the floods through the Arise program, so God can use any situation as long as you have the intention to let God use you. And as we learned last week, you don't have to have an impressive qualification for God to be able to use you. God built his entire church off the star pupil that didn't understand his own mission. So you don't need to go out there with this mindset of, I'm going to convert you. I'm going to go out and I'm going to share Jesus with you. You're going to be a church with me within a month, right? Instead, go out with the mindset of, what are your needs? How can I help you? Don't ask them to fill out a spirituality survey. Ask them what their needs are. How can I help you? What can I do for you? How can you go about meeting their needs? And if each of us is able to do that, as a whole church, if we go out and meet the needs of the people in our community, then it won't be long before everybody in the community is reached. It won't be long before Jesus can come back, because we will have made disciples of all nations. So that's my challenge to you, not just for this week, for every time in future until the second coming, is to go out and find people's needs and meet the needs.